So I have here Dr. Alda Benjamin from the University of Maryland. Hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Could you tell us something about your background and about your research and the work you are doing?
Sure. My work deals with the Assyrians in Iraq mainly. In the second half of the 20th century, beginning in the 1960s or so, and ending just before the Anfal campaign in 1988. I look at the role of the Assyrians in Iraq's socio-ideological movements of this period, and how do they situate themselves in relation to the state, which is gaining influence and strength at this time, and also in relation to the Iraqi opposition, and internally within the community. I'm interested in their intellectual movements, the urbanization of the community, their interaction still with the rural aspects, the villages and native towns that they leave, and gender relations, the role of Assyrian women in these movements, and their portrayal by intellectuals. I also include cultural aspects, so I have an interest in popular culture, songs of defiance, which are at this point generated to sort of counter the state's memory and narratives of the Assyrian community, and the transnational interactions that happen between Assyrians in Iraq, Assyrians in Syria, and the diasporas.
So your lecture was mainly about the role of women during the time you mentioned in Iraq and the social and political movement. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is a new research sort of direction that I've taken. I noticed that the memory of Sayfo lingers on decades later, and I noticed this in the publications of Assyrian presses and also in songs. I'm interested in the way Sayfo impacts gender relations and the representation of women in Assyrian communities in the second half of the 20th century. Though, you see remembrance of Sayfo by people who are documenting it in the 1930s. We have a wonderful poem by an Assyrian woman who writes about it, Nanasi Abraham, in 1935, just before completes it in 1935, just before her passing. And she's remembering 1918, July 18, 1918, a very, very important date for her when her father and family members were killed. We see examples of Sayfo remembered in the 70s and 80s, and Semel, of course, in songs, in this popular cultural resistance sort of that we see in music that's going back and forth between Assyrians in Iraq and the Americas generally. And, so for example, we have reference to during the Iraqi opposition, the uprising against the government, which you have since the 60s, but in the late 70s and 80s, Assyrians who are part of this resistance, Assyrian nationalists, are compared. Their fights against the government are compared to those of Sayfo earlier. Those who are executed by the government are called Sahde, and so they're Sahde joining the Sahduta of the 1915-1933. So the memory really lingers on, and I argue it has repercussions on gender relations and the representation of women.
Okay. As a non-historian, I like to ask questions about conferences like these. How could they inspire or have an impact on dealing with the situation our people are facing in their homelands these days? Do you got any inspirations for this?
The impact of what's going on our people is really tragic right now. But from a historical sort of it takes historians a while to analyze it, which is a problem, of course. But I think this is important because we see people coming together. A lot of people are mentioning news sources that they have located, and we see once again, our community being forced to leave their homelands, their villages, their towns, the last places that they resided in such as in the plains and other areas, and we're witnessing already the destruction of cultural heritage and sources, right? So it's something that we witnessed earlier, and that's any scholar studying the community will have problems with sources, and this is something unfortunately we have to deal with again, and hopefully we're doing enough to preserve our, first of all, the communities. I mean, that's of paramount importance, making sure that they are cared for, that they can go back to their villages and towns, but also saving our cultural heritage, because that, and the knowledge, not only of classical documents and classical religious sources, which are very, very important, and we know from the Chaldean Patriarch that at least 500 or so sources, this is a few months ago, so there might be more, that have been destroyed. We know of this. But also of modern forms of cultural production, of presses, that those are our modern history is also very important, and vernacular forms of the oral histories, the popular culture. You see some women in some interviews, such as your channel, I believe, here, who are interviewed, and then they recite poetry about their village, and they lament about their fate. These are things that need to also be documented and cared for.
Thank you for your work then. Thanks.